After years of anticipation, Netflix's live-action adaptation of the masterpiece Avatar The Last Airbender has finally arrived. I know I generally talk about adult animation on this channel, but the truth is that there is probably no fictional world I love more than that of Avatar The Last Airbender. I have rewatched both Avatar and The Legend of Korra more times than I can count. I own every art book, I read the graphic novels, I've read the regular novels. I cannot get enough of this world. I would honestly abandon my YouTube channels entirely for a chance to be lowest on the totem pole in an Avatar Studios writing room. I love it that much. So, as you might expect, as a fan and animation guy, I have been skeptical about Last Airbender really working in live action. If you're a fan of the channel, you probably know that I am generally a positive guy. I always give things a chance, and I do my best work when I criticize constructively, not with disdain or malice. And usually, if I really dislike something, I don't find much joy in talking about it at all. This is a slightly different case, because while I ultimately was not a huge fan of this live action adaptation, I am such a massive fan of the source material and franchise in general. I just have so much I feel I need to say about Netflix's Last Airbender. Yeah, this video is probably framed more negatively than my usual videos, but I promise it's not just negativity. There are plenty of things I like, and my feedback is mostly constructive. But I have a lot of thoughts about this adaptation, about its positives, about its shortcomings, and where the franchise might go from here. So, hey, let's get into it. Just a heads up, this video will contain major spoilers for the entire season of the new series and the entirety of the original series, as well as minor spoilers for The Legend of Korra, the Search graphic novels, and the Kyoshi books. If you're looking to avoid any of that, tread carefully. So, as to not be wildly negative right off the bat, I want to start by talking about the things I appreciated about this show. For one, I do think it's a good thing that they didn't approach this as a one-to-one recreation of the original series. That is the correct approach to take. Obviously, things need to be adjusted, condensed, expanded on, approached from a different angle to make the very idea of redoing the show worthwhile. The important thing is capturing the spirit and essence of the original, understanding its characters, themes, and messages, which is the aspect that I think is much more debatable in terms of whether or not they were successful. I actually did appreciate that they attempted to expand on some aspects of the series. It was admirable to try and include more Ozai and Azula in the first season. I don't think the sort of only shown in silhouette Ozai implementation from the animated series would have really worked as well in live action. So why not try to expand his role? We got added context to relationships like Zuko and Iroh, as well as added context to Zuko's banishment. I'll talk more about that in detail later, because there are aspects here I think really work, and some that do not. While I have issues with how condensed everything felt, they did get pretty creative with how they combined some of the stories. I at least admired the efforts to try to maintain so many individual stories from the original 20-episode season in this 8-episode version. Okay, and as a massive fan of the franchise and its expanded lore, I adored the way they implemented many of the concepts that came later in the franchise into this first season, utilizing the Fog of Lost Souls, which wasn't introduced until Legend of Korra, referencing Ko, the Face Stealer's mother, the Mother of Faces from the Search graphic novels, and especially how they alluded to Kyoshi and Kurik's backstories.
Did you know she was an orphan? Lived on the streets until she was hired as a housegirl for the richest family on the island.
This is blatantly referencing Kyoshi's history as depicted in the Kyoshi novels, Rise of Kyoshi and Shadow of Kyoshi by F.C. Yee, which, outside of the two series, are easily my favorite Avatar content. The graphic novels are fun continuations, but they sort of just maintain my interest in the existing world. Yee's novels had me on the edge of my seat. They're the best expansion of the universe outside of the shows very easily. And the details they revealed from Kurik's life are also pulled right from Shadow of Kyoshi.
I discovered dark spirits were on the verge of crossing over into our realm from the spirit world. I had to stop them.
Kurik is such a fascinating avatar. He died very young and was seen as a complete failure as an avatar. However, he was secretly waging this war against these specific spirits to prevent them from harming the world. A real unsung hero. It's cool to see that aspect of his history acknowledged in something that so many fans of the series will see. I appreciated that there were details like this intertwined for mega fans like myself, and also introduced a taste of that expanded lore for the fans who haven't explored the content outside of the shows. But there are also a lot of general issues I have with the series as well. While I fully understand the stories have to be condensed, and I even praise their creativity in combining some of them, there are clear downsides to trying to include as much as they did in a mere 8-episode season. The bigger issue is that it simply dilutes the impact that some of these stories were meant to have. When you take 2 to 4 different episode storylines, shrink them down a bit, and intertwine them, they aren't given the space in the narrative structure to affect the characters and audience in the same way. Combining Jet's freedom fighters and the Mechanist storylines in homage Omashu is decently economic in its storytelling, but the story isn't even remotely as powerful as either the defense of the Northern Air Temple or Jet's decision to destroy the Fire Nation occupied town from the original show, and there are countless examples of this, unfortunately. The other big issue is that by roping all of these stories together, it also condenses the breadth of locations we saw in the original series, which makes the world itself feel much smaller. Using that previous story as an example, we lose out on seeing the Northern Air Temple. It reveals Jet's camp to basically be on the outskirts of Omashu, and we don't get to see the Earth Kingdom town that's been occupied by the Fire Nation, which goes a really long way in showcasing the extent of the Fire Nation's control. One of the things that makes the Avatar universe so incredibly rich is the extent of its world building. It's such a massive lived-in world, it feels like there are dozens of different stories from different perspectives that could be told in it. I do not feel the same way when I'm watching the live-action counterpart. Even something as simple as failing to showcase many of the iconic hybrid animals from the franchise really harms that world building. We see a few in the opening sequence, which are barely visible at night. The big chocobo-like birds are showcased a lot. It was cool to see the badger mole and June's Shirshu, but even Appa and Momo are barely utilized in the show. Appa has so much personality in the original, and it doesn't come through at all here, which will absolutely be a detriment if they choose to adapt the arc where he's taken from Aang. Okay, let's talk about the action and bending in general. I find it serviceable. It's obviously leagues better than a lot of the stuff from the Shyamalan film. They did a much better job making the bending an extension of martial arts rather than a magic power. In general, the fire bending looks really good across the board, but it's definitely still lacking. In particular, the water bending, which always feels incredibly slow. It doesn't feel like there's any real impact to these hits, which is a ridiculous shame because waterbending has easily some of the coolest combat in the original series, and this was always one of the biggest concerns I had going into this show. Bending is never going to be as cool in live action as it is in animation. The intertwining of the motions, expressions, and weight are so important in selling the concept of bending. Even very simple details just make it feel so much less impactful. Look at the scene where the Earth Nation officer is threatening Iroh by holding a massive boulder above his head. Look at the lack of strain. It just looks like he's holding his hands up. It should look as though he is holding up a massive boulder. The weight of that piece of earth should be apparent in his stance, in his expression, in his body tension. None of these things are being conveyed. It just takes away from the believability of the world, in my opinion. And sadly, though the production design is very good and clearly very inspired, the world feels far too sanitized. The costumes are a really good example of this. They are picture-perfect adaptations of the costumes we saw in the animated series, but they are so unbelievably clean looking. If you're bringing this world into live action, it has to feel real. I don't buy for even a moment that these costumes have ever been worn outside of a dressing room or soundstage. They are squeaky clean. The locations are also very accurate looking, and plenty of the broader establishing shots look excellent. Like I said, in general, the production design is really good, but I don't think anything is as detrimental to the show as the failures in characterization. I somewhat respect their decision to open the series a bit differently, opting to show Aang at the Southern Air Temple before he runs away and becomes frozen, but in execution, this is a complete mess, given that it was actually a perfect opportunity for some genuine character establishing moments. Instead, it has some of the worst instances of tell don't show I've ever seen.
I know who I am. I like to play airball and eat banana cakes and goof off with my friends. That's who I am.
This is a terrible way to introduce your protagonist, especially when you had a prime opportunity to actually show these things. Stuff we see plenty of in flashbacks in the original series. Opting to tell these events chronologically instead of alluding and flashing back like in the original show isn't necessarily a bad idea, but failing to show the audience who Aang is in his introduction is just a clear failure in writing. Sure, we learn everything about Aang's lore in this opening, but it's just a full-on info dump. That information shouldn't take precedence over seeing who Aang is, which is done so brilliantly in the OG. Instead, we're shown the Airbender Jedi Council, who again, info dumps all of Aang's lore on the audience. It's like they're filming a textbook instead of a proper character introduction. And Aang's inner conflict itself is severely diminished here as well. The entire reason he gets frozen is that he just wanted to go for a spin with Appa to clear his head and got caught in a storm while doing it, which in itself is so silly. Why would he just go for a casual fly into a storm? If it was casual, he should have immediately immediately turned around. It ultimately boils down to a whoopsie instead of a deliberate decision to avoid his responsibility like in the original, which is both a much better justification for him flying into a storm to actually run away, and also adds so much weight to the burden he bears as the last airbender. The idea that he actively abandoned his people only for them to then be massacred. These seem like tiny details in the moment, but as soon as you expound on them, you see the ripple effect and how negatively they can affect the characters as a whole. And I'm not entirely sure why we needed to see the airbender genocide at all. I understand wanting to show something different than the original show, but in some cases, it's just so clear why the story was told the way it is. It makes a much bigger impact to first experience the remains of the Air Nomad Society through Aang's eyes for multiple reasons. This is what Aang sees when he finds Gyatso in the original series. This beautiful shot that paints a horrifying picture of Gyatso's last stand. It shows that he was being swarmed and bombarded by firebending soldiers, that it was an overwhelming assault on a peaceful people. Seeing the aftermath as your first glimpse at the reality of the genocide is so much more powerful than seeing Gyatso get burned to a crisp in these edgy, violent moments. And most importantly, it's Aang's realization.
Firebenders? They were here?
This is the moment that he truly accepts the gravity of what happened to his people, built upon his excellent characterization. Leading to this, we see his optimism and naivete in regards to what he'll find at the Southern Air Temple.
Just because no one has seen an airbender doesn't mean the Fire Nation killed them all. They probably escaped.
In this new version, he accepts that his people are gone almost immediately and seems to go to the Southern Air Temple just to double check. They're going through the same motions as the original show in a more condensed, less meaningful way, failing to understand the underlying nuances that made it impactful. Look, the film version is still much worse overall, but this was actually something that they at least understood was important to Aang's character.
They must be playing some trick or something. Monkey Yatsu's gonna try and jump out and scare me at any moment.
The Last Airbender movie understanding any of the story's nuances better than the new show is a problem. And sadly, this wasn't just an issue for Aang. There is just a general characterization issue in this series. Sokka is probably the most frustrating example. It came out before the series dropped that they were planning to remove the sexist parts of his attitude from early on in the show, which deeply concerned me considering how important it was for Sokka to learn early on how deeply rooted and toxic that part of his attitude was. But it's actually a symptom of an even deeper misunderstanding of Sokka's character. That lesson was one of the first examples of one of Sokka's larger themes. At first, as the only man left in the Southern Water Tribe, Sokka sees himself as their protector, as this warrior, and over the course of the series, Sokka is repeatedly humbled. He has decent instincts, but he has to earn the skills and experience needed to actually play a substantial part in the fight. Humbling himself to Suki was the first part of this journey, one that would come to a pretty substantial conclusion in Season 3's Sokka's Master. Instead, this new show makes Sokka look pretty competent right off the bat. In his leadership back in the Southern Water Tribe, in his fighting abilities, he's generally a lot more capable. In fact, they ultimately give Sokka the opposite issue as a character. Rather than overconfidence in his abilities, he's got severe insecurities about them. Unfortunately, this isn't particularly well conveyed through Sokka's actions. It's mostly told to us in a Spirit World flashback, where he overhears his father criticizing his performance in the ice dodging trials. The ways they choose to convey Sokka's lack of confidence are flimsy at best and deeply detrimental to the themes at worst. Most bizarrely, literally everyone in the show is just a massive Sokka fanboy. He rarely makes mistakes, he rarely has to prove himself, characters are just drawn to him, and this has absolutely devastating effects on the Kyoshi Warrior storyline. In the original story, Sokka's eyes are opened and his worldview is changed thanks to Suki and the Kyoshi Warriors. He has to dig deep and humble himself, asking Suki to formally train him, despite his former worldview leading him to believe that he, as a man, is much more capable, culminating in one of the best moments in the season.
I treated you like a girl when I should have treated you like a warrior.
I am a warrior. But I'm a girl, too.
It's pitch perfect writing, helping Sokka fully understand the failures in his worldview as Suki maintains the agency that is so important for her to convey that lesson to Sokka. In the new series, Sokka still sorta trains with Suki, but it's seemingly meant to help bolster his own self-confidence, to help show him that he actually can be the biggest, strongest boy, and that he has what it takes to fight the Fire Nation. But they seem to be even more focused on using these scenes as a vehicle for Suki to fawn over Sokka. It's framed as though Sokka's presence in her world is fully shifting her own worldview, literally the opposite of what was conveyed in the original.
Thank you, Sokka.
For what?
For bringing the world to me.
In the first series, Suki challenges Sokka's beliefs, trains him, and helps him grow. In the new show, Sokka's mere existence is praised as having helped Suki and given her a better life. Sokka basically showed up to be told, "You're really great, actually," and by merely being in his presence, Suki's life is made more fulfilling. There's an unbelievable irony that by removing Sokka's sexism, they managed to instead make Suki's characterization incredibly sexist. Truly a disaster. In the original show, this was also a lesson that is deeply important to the overall themes of the entire series, the way its main characters reject the colonialist narratives perpetuated by the Fire Nation and the war in general. My friend Jesse Gender made a great video about this. I highly recommend you check that out. One aspect of Sokka's story in the new show that I do like is this idea that over the course of the season, he learns that he has different kinds of skills outside of just being a warrior, something he learns in his time with the Mechanist. I just also think these ideas kind of contradict their messages in stories like this one with Suki. I wish it had been a bit more cohesive. Suki isn't even the only instance of girls fawning over Sokka either. The changes made at the Northern Water Tribe are similarly baffling. In the original show, Sokka and Yue's connection is used as a means to challenge some of the more dogmatic aspects of the Northern Water Tribe. She's basically a prisoner of their monarchical system, betrothed to someone else. There's no agency in her choices or love life, despite being interested in Sokka. Now in this show, she has already broken off her engagement to Han, partially because of a shoehorned spirit world connection between Yue and Sokka seen earlier in the season.
He is everything that a girl could want. But he is not the boy of my dreams.
So now, instead of Yue's worldview being challenged because of a genuine connection she felt with another human being, Sokka is simply the boy of her dreams, an otherworldly, intangible connection. It does Yue a disservice, and it does Sokka a disservice. And by sort of brushing off the Han/Yue betrothal as a thing of the past, it completely removes the love triangle, which I firstly think is just a cowardly move, but secondly, it completely changes the dynamics in a way that once again harms Sokka's character journey. Rather than confidently showcase the knowledge he's gained through experience over the course of the season, it's goaded out of him. He doesn't really even understand that he's gained this experience. It aligns more with the arc they tried to set up with the Spirit World flashback to his father, but it also deeply conflicts with everything else we've seen from Sokka over the course of this season. In the original series, it was a satisfying culmination of the experience Sokka had garnered while traveling to the Northern Water Tribe. In the remake, it once again is an excuse for characters to fawn over how much they like Sokka. It removes conflict in a deeply uninteresting way. Why is everybody a Sokka fanboy? It's just so bizarre to completely subvert the original characterization, like entirely. Katara is a character who gets shafted in an entirely different way, in that they really sanded down her edges. Katara is supposed to be this aggressively passionate person. She fully has her own sense of right and wrong, and she will let you know if you're conflicting with that. That's what we see in the very first sequence of the original series. And based on the fact that they removed the sexist aspects of Sokka, it feels like this was another change made to mitigate backlash for Katara possibly seeming like the angry, nagging woman of the group, which sadly just removes all of her personality. Katara is an unbelievably strong character in the original, and she is a shell of her former self in this. I wish I had more specifics to even criticize in regard to Katara, but she's sadly just kinda there. And this is no fault of the actress, it's fully on the writing and direction. Iroh is another character who unfortunately suffers in the live-action adaptation, especially frustrating as his animated counterpart is one of the greatest characters in TV history. I did appreciate that they started putting Iroh and Aang together from some of the earliest points in the series. Their dynamic was one of my favorites in the original, and I like that they tried to tap into that early. Unfortunately, the way Iroh is written here leaves a lot to be desired. I hate the way he dances around the Fire Nation's motives here and reasons for which the war was incited.
Others believe that true stability in this world can only happen under our rule. So the drive to conquer is a drive for peace.
I do not believe that at this point in his life, Iroh would be entertaining these ideas in this way, even if he's walking on eggshells doing it. While Iroh is in a precarious position because of his relation to the royal family, one of the most important traits he possesses is that he is steadfast in his beliefs. The way his conversation with Aang is framed, it's almost as though he is actively questioning his place in the conflict.
And the belief is that by capturing you, the Fire Nation can finally bring that about.
Is that what you believe?
I must leave.
These small things change the perception of Iroh's characterization and belief system, and this isn't the only example. Later in the season, they adapt Zuko's conflict with some of the members of his guard from the storm. This is when Iroh relays the circumstances around Zuko's exile to his guard, and it allows these characters and the audience to empathize with Zuko's struggle all the more. But the difference in the way in which Iroh relays this information is night and day between these versions of the show. Iroh is supposed to be a caring and deeply understanding man. When he approaches the men and offers to tell them the story, he pointedly is doing so delicately and sympathetically. He approaches them as fellow people, not as underlings.
Who does Zuko think he is?
Do you really want to know?
General Iroh. We were just...
It's okay. May I join you?
This is also partially because he understands that Zuko's behavior towards them is not acceptable. He is trying to help his nephew by conveying his pain and trauma to these men so that they can better understand him and sympathize with him. He isn't doing it to chastise or reprimand the men, but in the live action version, that is exactly how it comes across.
Zhao is not the one who deserves your loyalty. Zuko is.
I don't believe for a second that Iroh would see Zuko throw a tantrum and treat these men so poorly only to immediately defend his behavior. Iroh loves his nephew and he knows that he's a good person deep down who is finding his way, but he isn't supposed to excuse Zuko's immaturity. Iroh would absolutely be sympathetic to the people who Zuko is treating poorly and sympathetic to the traumas that have led Zuko to behave this way. And that is exactly what the original show portrays, but this one takes away Iroh's man of the people quality and gives him an attitude that makes it seem like he's above those he's speaking to. I actually do like one change to the details of Zuko's exile here. The idea that his outburst was in defense of a specific troop of soldiers who were going to be sacrificed, and that this very troop was then placed as Zuko's guard. It's a cool addition that adds even more integrity to Zuko's underlying character. But what I hate is that Iroh basically uses it as a way to excuse Zuko's behavior.
We're the 41st. And you're all alive because of my nephew's sacrifice.
The Iroh I know would be able to convey the reality of Zuko's integrity without excusing his immaturity, without saying to the guard, "Suck it up, dude." I do think that for the most part, they've done a pretty good job with Zuko. He's still immature and he's struggling to find himself while obviously having that aforementioned underlying integrity. They portrayed his exile backstory pretty well, but I do think that they've maybe made some mistakes in regards to his relationship with Iroh. And this is a particularly tough one to criticize because the reality is that in these moments, these are things I really like about this new show. Lu Ten's funeral comes to mind, Iroh's pain, and Zuko choosing to be there for his uncle, giving Iroh Lu Ten's medal. This was one of the few moments this season that really got me emotional. It's a lovely moment. But in the greater context of the story, I fear that this might be undermining how impactful some of the most important moments of the series will be down the line. This version of the show is very explicit in portraying Zuko as Iroh's surrogate son, and Zuko very blatantly acknowledges and embraces that.
Lu Ten would have been proud to have you as his father.
Which again, as a fan of these characters, is lovely to see. However, a massive part of Zuko's journey is retroactively realizing, after he believes it's too late, that Iroh was the father figure he needed all along. He betrays Iroh, deeply regrets it, and their eventual reunion is an audience-sobbing, emotionally impactful moment because it is Zuko finally expressing those feelings to Iroh. Which, for Iroh, isn't just about getting Zuko back as his son, but about Zuko finally finding himself. I just fear that front-loading the story this early with these moments is going to undercut the eventual emotional impact, even if they are lovely moments in the short term. That being said, the episode that features this, Masks, is very easily the best in the series. Truly, in terms of both adaptation and general storytelling. They mostly combine the storm and blue spirit, and I think this was a really smart instinct. Both episodes go a long way to subvert what we already know about Zuko. They're natural stories to combine. Kudos to the team for making that choice. I was even just generally impressed with the action execution here. I think this has easily the best bending in the series, and I was hootin' and or hollerin' when they actually did the ladder jumping sequence, and it looked good too, just something I easily could have seen them say, "Nah, that's too hard, we'll change it." I particularly loved the expanded sequence where Aang and Zuko chat. The whole added storyline of Zuko's Avatar journal was a cool choice, and Aang complimenting his drawings, that's really great stuff, very in character. And I liked Zuko sort of relenting and accepting that praise and validation, something he isn't used to receiving. This just worked really well all around. Okay, we gotta talk about Boomy, another victim of just completely foolish characterization changes. I understand wanting to showcase a character who blames Aang for disappearing on the world. That's a pretty natural thing for people in these circumstances to feel, but forcing that role on Boomy makes him an entirely different character. Boomy tries to teach Aang a lesson by challenging him to a fight to the death. Even more baffling, he chastises Aang for just wanting to goof off instead of taking his job as the Avatar seriously. We're talking about Boomy, the guy whose entire first episode in the OG is an elaborate prank/lesson.
Who cares about, saving the world? No, more fun to goof off, am I right?
And even more frustrating is that so many of his criticisms towards Aang make no sense given the events of this show. Aang is almost never shown goofing off. We get brief moments of him playing with kids in the Water Tribe and on Kyoshi Island. We get one little splash fight with Katara, but in general, Aang is incredibly focused on his goal in this adaptation, which is actually something the writers of the adaptation claimed was an intentional shift in focus, avoiding the side distractions that were featured in the original, which just makes no sense if you're going to have a character then also berate Aang for being distracted, without showing it, of course. I don't hate the idea behind this Boomy and Aang interaction. Because everything is so condensed, it's a nice thought to have Aang be forced to reckon with the ways he's hurt his friend in his absence. But there has got to have been a way to do this without throwing Boomy's initial characterization out the window. He just feels like an entirely different person here.
Let it fall, Aang, and learn what it means to be the Avatar.
Might be time to talk about the secret tunnel. This is actually something pulled from season 2, and oh boy was its purpose in the story changed entirely. And to be honest, I don't hate the idea of using the secret tunnel for Katara and Sokka to work out their own issues as brother and sister. That's a pretty reasonable adjustment to make, kinda creative. I also really loved the cave painting animated sequence that explained the secret tunnels. That was really beautifully done. However, it definitely makes me question what their intentions are in the shipping department, especially given that they served up this thick slab of Zutara bait in Omashu. The Cave of Two Lovers is obviously a major step in Aang and Katara's budding romance, and this new series has pointedly avoided all hints of their romance thus far. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. My gut says they're sort of holding off until Aang looks less like an actual child, probably a smart move, and with the seasons taking longer to make and the writers anticipating timeline story changes to accommodate this, I hope they're simply pushing this off until the characters and actors are older. However, it's hard to imagine that they haven't entertained the idea of pivoting to Zutara, thanks to the massive shipping culture built around them. And look, ship whoever you want, but I think this would be such a slap in the face to the story and lore of the franchise. And it would be hard to imagine, since they've paid such close attention to Kyoshi and Kuruk's entire expanded history, for them to say screw it to the literal protagonist of the show. They obviously would never be able to do a Korra follow-up if they actually went through with Zutara, or if they did, it would simply be an entirely different story. Okay, let's talk the other avatars again real quick. I did like the quick glimpses we got of the past avatars in this, a bit more substantial than in the original show, and I personally didn't hate the fact that they changed Roku's Rampage in the animated show to a Kyoshi-focused takeover. As a fan of Kyoshi, it was exciting to see her showcase her abilities, even if I'm not sure it served the story. Sometimes I can turn my brain off and fanboy out a little bit. I do wish the characterization of Kyoshi and Kuruk offered a bit more than we got, however. Both characters felt very stoic, and I know the original show also portrayed them as stoic, but given that they were actually diving into the novels for backstory information, it would have been nice if they shifted their personalities a tad to match the stuff established in those stories. They just felt like these ancient statuesque figureheads and not like real characters. Unlike Roku, who had a ton of personality in his one scene.
And hop on one leg?
Unfortunately, Roku is the one former Avatar whose personality we see lots of in the original series, and this just feels completely different than what we got. If you're going to adjust the past Avatars' personalities, I don't understand why you would choose to change the most defined and keep in place the least defined. I am very curious about their decision to pull so many story aspects from future seasons into season 1 as well. I mentioned I respected the idea to try and implement more Ozai and Azula in this early. However, I'm not really sure it strengthens either of their characters. I did think it was interesting to see the way Ozai pit his kids against each other, the way he motivates Azula by giving Zuko undue praise, something he obviously would never do in Zuko's presence, but I fear that the show is attempting to make Azula a little bit more sympathetic, which was always one of the strengths of Azula as a villain. I think a lot of projects these days struggle to just allow villains to be bad, and Azula was an amazing character because she was so unabashedly awful. I was also surprised they decided to explicitly show the events of Kaya's death, something not shown until season 3 in the original series, but it sort of felt like the show was struggling to find an emotional center for Katara, who sadly seemed to have the least actual character development over these 8 episodes. They really focused on her relationship with her mother, and I guess they wanted to really expound on that early instead of saving it for later. I was very confused by their use of Wang Shitong in the spirit world. I love the character, and I love the character model and design here. He looked great, but he's just playing an entirely different role in this. Felt very out of place, very shoehorned. In fact, the entire use of the spirit world is kind of a mess. I was so bummed to see them butcher the message of Heibai's rampage. They used Heibai, but sort of ignored the most important aspects of the lessons that both he and Aang learned in the process, and by combining it with other spirit world storylines, they just made the entire thing a convoluted mess. Changing lore so that Katara and Sokka can enter the spirit world, bypassing Heibai's story to implement Ko the Face Stealer, and make that storyline the reason that Aang needs to visit Roku. It just felt like they were floundering to implement popular parts of the first season and managed to really butcher why those parts were impactful. Ko the Face Stealer was, at the very least, very cool. A great looking model. Seriously captured the terrifying nature of the original very, very well. And I love that they implemented references to the Mother of Faces in this story also. Honestly, it really makes me wonder if they intend to use some of the story and lore from the graphic novel trilogy The Search, which is the Avatar follow-up that finally answers the question of what happened to Zuko's mother, given that it's the one major unanswered question from the original series, and one that fans were very upset was left unanswered in the show itself. I wouldn't be surprised if they actually chose to incorporate it into the story a bit earlier in the live-action adaptation. The Mother of Faces is a very blatant reference specifically to what happened to Zuko's mother. As a fan of the expanded material, it would, at the very least, be really interesting to see adapted, especially because it appears as though the upcoming Avatar Studios projects don't intend to adapt the graphic novels. Oh yeah, one more slightly big issue. I know they're abandoning the labeled book/season titles in this remake, so this isn't technically the water season, but why didn't Aang attempt to waterbend even one time? Very strange choice. The fact that he's sort of forced to rapidly develop his bending skills is such an important part of the original narrative. It's weird to ignore it almost entirely. Alright, let's wrap up by talking about the finale. I do think, all things considered, the finale events were adapted somewhat well. The way they opted to expand the story about the Northern Water Tribe's sexist ban on women waterbenders was, I think, an effective change, making it less about Katara specifically as some kind of exception to the rule, and more about changing the culture as a whole. Actually a pretty smart move, even though her battle with Pakku was super underwhelming compared to the original. I also cannot pretend I didn't enjoy seeing Aang go full kaiju mode. The VFX looked pretty damn cool. It still looks better animated, but a great effort nonetheless. And I appreciated the expanded context of Yue's ascension to the moon. The idea that, if she didn't, Aang would be stuck fused with the ocean spirit, this massive destructive kaiju that would wander the ocean forever seeking its pair that doesn't exist anymore. It's a cool idea. But as a whole, this series lacks cohesion in its characterization and themes, and I think this is largely on the writing. It has some of the worst examples of overly expository dialogue I've seen in years. Its favorite thing to do is truly tell, not show. It certainly adapted the events of the original series, but it didn't do so in a way that truly understands the underlying themes and ideas behind Avatar The Last Airbender. It was a genuinely very frustrating watch for me. I think what makes me saddest about this adaptation is that it's ultimately going to have the exact opposite effect on its audience that the original did. Nickelodeon's Avatar The Last Airbender is absolutely a kids show, but people go into it expecting something juvenile, only to be shocked to discover that it is filled with incredible characters, themes, and messages, a nuanced portrayal of the realities of war and imperialism, and some incredibly outstanding action. It's a kids show that can be enjoyed by people of all ages, but the way this Netflix version is framed as this big epic fantasy on the same scale as Game of Thrones is going to have countless newcomers take a look at the franchise, and because it doesn't handle any of those things nearly as well as the original, they'll ultimately decide, damn, this is just for kids. I truly just struggle to determine why these live action adaptations are ever necessary. My question is If the show is going to tell the same story, but sacrifice the quality of action, characters, themes, and storylines, if it's not capable of doing anything better than or even as well as the original, why should it exist? What is the point? I am obviously a massive fan of the franchise, and I will absolutely be watching the entirety of Netflix's adaptation as long as they make it. I'm too curious about the ways they may choose to change the story, and if nothing else, Netflix's version of the show has absolutely reinvigorated my love for the original. I know that's a bit of a backhanded compliment, but it once again has me jonesing to rewatch both shows, reread the graphic novels and books, pore over the art books, and get hyped for the upcoming Avatar Studios projects that are on the horizon. Look, I know this was very negative and rooted in my love for the original series. I have issues with the changes in characterization, but I really hope this series can win me over by selling me on the changes they've made. I would love to see season 2 of the live action series right the ship a bit in regards to how this story is being adapted, and I am cheering for it, even if I didn't like what they delivered this time. And that is about all I've got for you. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll catch you next time. Peace.
I stay mellow watching Johnny Two Cellos. He talks cartoons, he's a really cool fellow. He keeps you posted on adult cartoons. If that's what you're into, then grab a spoon and a very big bowl of your favorite cereal. Feels like Saturday morning cartoon material. Johnny Two Cellos, watch him on YouTube. Now enjoy this groove and bust a move.